Back in 2013, I bought a PlayStation 3, and the first game I ever played on it was a little game called The Last of Us. I'm sure you've heard of it. This game kickstarted my love for the zombie subgenre, and I've consumed just about all popular zombie media in the years since, from World War Z, 28 Days Later, to The Walking Dead, to the George Romero films. However, there's one story that fits into the zombie subgenre that I find incredibly disturbing and unique. I'm referring to a book called They All Died Screaming by Kristopher Triana. As you may be able to tell from the title of this book, it's not exactly a happy story. This is a splatterpunk novel, the first splatterpunk book that I have read in full. And to briefly explain for those not aware, splatterpunk is a subgenre of horror that combines two words, splatter and punk. The word splatter essentially translates to excessive gore or violence, and the word punk refers to a intent or desire from the creator to go against some kind of societal norm. Therefore, the majority of splatterpunk books feature extremely controversial subject matter, including but not limited to substance use, SA, violence against animals, and pretty much everything else you can think of that is societally unacceptable. And while a lot of these books could fall into the category of shock for the sake of shock value, the author is just attempting to be as controversial as possible in order to gain notoriety. I think that this story has value. It made me think about certain things in life through a different lens. However, if any of these subjects make you too uncomfortable, feel free to click off of this video now or at any point. Without further ado, let's get into They All Died Screaming by Kristopher Triana. The book opens with a prologue. In this prologue, there is a character referred to as the man digging a grave. We don't know the man's name, but it's pretty irrelevant. The man has a shovel in one hand and a bottle of booze in the other. And when the man decides it's time for him to take a break, he tosses the shovel to a character referred to as the boy. It then goes on to describe how there is no sunshine here on this farm, and that there are just weeds and bramble, and the stench of pig feces is permeating the air. As the man sits down against a tree, his back cracks like Jiffy Pop. The boy used to love popcorn. He missed it. He missed a lot of things. As the boy digs, he sees a lone worm in the soil, and fearing that the man would not show mercy upon this worm, he covers it with the soil in order to protect it. Next to the boy is a mildewed army bag, a grim reminder of creatures less fortunate. Chapter 1 switches to the perspective of the character named Chuck. The first line of Chuck's chapter reads, "The bitch was screaming." This is referring to one of the neighbors in his apartment complex. She is having an argument with her boyfriend. Other neighbors in the apartment complex are yelling and opening their doors, telling her to be quiet. As this boyfriend is leaving and going toward the stairway, the woman notices Chuck standing in the hallway, sort of eavesdropping, and she loudly offers Chuck a blowjob in order to make this boyfriend jealous or make him not leave, but he continues to leave the building. The woman turns to Chuck and asks him if he wants a drink. Chuck enters this woman's apartment, which is very messy, filled with dirty dishes and the smell of a litter box. Chuck says, "Nice place you got here." The woman says, "Yeah, right." She offers him a cigarette. The woman introduces herself as Leslie. She has no family, no real career, and now she doesn't even have a lousy boyfriend. Chuck asks, "So it's really over?" And she says that it was over with Tony even before tonight. Chuck said, "In my experience, when someone starts talking about leaving, they're already gone." Leslie goes on to complain about her job a little bit, and then she asks Chuck what he does for a living. And he says nothing because he recently got fired from his electronics warehouse job for drinking on the job and stealing a TV. She tells him that she's charmed by his honesty, and he says that he does it on principle. He works his ass off for almost nothing, so he takes what he believes he deserves. Leslie says, "You're not going to rip me off, are you?" And Chuck says, "No, I only steal from big businesses." Leslie says she doesn't have anything worth stealing anyway. It'd be like trying to rob a dumpster. Chuck says, "So you got no problem drinking with a thief?" Leslie says, "Not unless you have a problem drinking with an alcoholic tramp." And he says, "Never have before." And she poured him another drink. Chapter 2 switches back to the perspective of the boy. And now the boy is in a shopping mall, panicking, trying to find his mother. And it becomes clear quite quickly that this is before the events of the prologue. He'd only let go of his mother's hand for a moment to go look in the water fountain for quarters, but she was gone. He went back into the store to try to scan the other women's faces, trying to find her. When he failed, he went back out into the main area of the mall, back toward the fountain. His mouth is drying out and his eyes are filling with tears. He thinks that it's all his fault. He should have stayed close. But he was almost 10 and he didn't want to hold his mom's hand everywhere. But now he wished that he would have. When he backed into something, it was a hand on his shoulder. A middle-aged man with slick-back hair and small yellow teeth smiled at him. He was wearing a security guard uniform. He said, "You can't be running around like that in my mall. You could slip by the fountain." The security guard says, "You okay, kid?" The boy shook his head no. The guard asks where his parents are, and he says that he lost his mother. As the guard asks him to describe his mother, he tells him that she has red hair and brown eyes, and she's wearing a red coat. The security guard stops him and says, "She's in the office. We've been looking all over for you." He was with an adult now, someone with authority. Mom and Dad always told him to find a policeman if he was ever in trouble. The guard says that he is going to take the boy to the office building of the mall. He says he'll drive him over. He leads the boy away, holding his hand. He says, "Don't worry, kid. Everything's going to be all right." And the boy says, "Sir, where are we going?" And the guard says, "Like I told you, your mommy's in the manager's building on the other side. We have to go around through the parking lot." And instead of there being a white van that says mall security or something along those lines, it is a rusty brown pickup truck with one green door. There were no hubcaps, and the windshield was cracked along the bottom. And as the boy enters this truck on the passenger side, he thinks that it smells like a petting zoo that his parents took him to. As the man drives around to the back of the parking lot, he says he just needs to grab his medicine real quick from the glove compartment. But instead of grabbing medicine, he grabs a small brown bottle and a rag. And after pouring some of the liquid onto the cloth, he lunges at the boy and knocks him out. But not before the boy watches this man's character shift entirely. As he was being a security guard before, he was now animalistic and bestial, and spit dripped out of his mouth onto the boy's brow as he was forced into a deep sleep. Chapter 3 switches back to the perspective of Chuck. Chuck is hanging out at the bar with his friend Eugene. Eugene is your average conspiracy theorist. He thinks that the government is putting fluoride in the water to turn the frogs gay, things like that. As Eugene is going on about how Big Pharma is trying to stop him from using crystals and home remedies, Chuck is kind of ignoring him. A beer slides down the bar and Chuck catches it, and he says, "Thanks, barman." And that wasn't a nickname that he made up. Apparently, this man just wants to be called Barman. And Chuck thinks for a minute about how he probably has some kind of controversial or cool past that led to his nickname. Eugene tells Chuck that he saw him go into the girl from 213's apartment last night. And he tells him to be careful. And Chuck says, "What do you mean?" And Eugene says that Leslie is like a revolving door, and that he's seen many men leave her while she's screaming in the hallway. Chuck says, so what? Eugene says she could have all kinds of STDs. Chuck says something very strange. I don't catch diseases, STDs or otherwise. Okay. And Chuck goes on to tell Eugene that he shouldn't even be talking because he's such a germaphobe. He wears gloves to pump gas. He'll probably never touch a woman anyway. Eugene is about to head out from the bar. Barman tells him that next time he has to actually pay his tab. And Eugene kind of sadly nods and leaves. Chuck looks at the TV above the bar, and it says, more polar ice caps snap free after mass melting. Chuck goes on to ask Barman if he's looking for anybody. Barman says, are you asking me out? Chuck says, no, I'm looking for work. Barman said, you got fired again? And he says that he would be dumb to hire Chuck, knowing his work history. Chuck says he'll do anything. He'll even scrub the graffiti off of the men's room. Barman says he likes that graffiti. It's local color, gives the place charm. Chuck says that that graffiti is all jokes about taking a shit and prostitute phone numbers and phone numbers for a couple of queers. Barman says, poetry of the streets, Chucky. Poetry of the streets. He says that he's not in charge of hiring anyone anyway. This is owned by Rudy. Chuck asks where Rudy is. Barman says he doesn't keep tabs on Rudy, he keeps tabs on the bar. On the TV screen again, the legend says more suicides in Canada. As Chuck leaves the bar, he is smacked in the face by the heat of the city. Not only is it extremely hot, but there's also apparently a garbage strike happening, meaning that the garbage workers are not taking out the garbage, and it's just piling on the edge of every street. As you can imagine, hot garbage does not smell good. It says the August night was oppressive, moist in the worst way, enhancing the stink of the ghetto. He thought of it as moving through a pond of menstrual blood. And as Chuck is on his way home, he lights up a cigarette and goes behind a dumpster to take a piss. And he sees a cockroach and decides to piss directly onto the cockroach, watching it drown. And he thinks that killing another living thing with your piss had to be the ultimate dominance of another species, whatever that means. These days, it was rare for Chuck to feel dominant of anything, even vermin. He knew that he wasn't doing good in life. The only reason he had somewhere to live is because he faked a work injury a while back and used the settlement money to pay for 9 months of rent in advance. As Chuck enters his apartment building, he hears Leslie once again yelling, but this time happy. She's talking to the pizza delivery place on the phone. And she asks this pizza guy if they can pick up beer from the store on the way over, which they say no to. And after she hangs up, she sees Chuck, and she throws her arms around him and says that it's great to see him. And then she asks, what's his name again? She's obviously very drunk, and after he reintroduces himself, she invites him inside for pizza. Leslie goes on to complain about her job once again, talking about giving out little sample cups to people and watching them eat in front of her and then talk with their mouths full. And she calls them bunch of vultures, bunch of pigs. Chuck winces when she says this. And Leslie says, but the worst is when you get stuck with some old person telling you their entire life story as if you care. And she goes on to say, I wish they would all just die. And Chuck says, the customers? She says, no, everyone. Chuck says, what about your friends and relatives and neighbors? And Leslie says, I don't have any of those, and the neighbors in this apartment complex seem to all be losers anyway, or they wouldn't be here. Chuck knows that he can't really cheer people up very well. He's tried to, and the last thing he wants is for Leslie to start crying because that is just something that he does not want to handle right now. He says, the best way to get over one man is to get under another. Chuck and Leslie proceed to have sex, and as they're doing that, the pizza delivery guy comes, and Leslie barely even pulls down her nightgown as she goes to answer the door, therefore giving a little flash to the pizza delivery man. She throws a $20 bill at him and shuts the door, and she and Chuck proceed to continue having sex, sort of over the top of the pizza. She's sort of bent over it, and she eats 3 slices before they're done. And she has a decent amount of grease and sauce all over her chest. When they are finished, Leslie says, "I needed that." And Chuck says, "Me or the pizza?" And Leslie just smiles in response. Wow, okay, chapter 4. We go back to the perspective of the boy, and the last thing that happened to the boy that we know of is that he was knocked unconscious with chloroform by a man pretending to be a security guard at the mall. And the first sentence of this is, "The cage was meant for dogs." He was in a basement or a cellar. There was a small snake skin a few feet away on the ground, and there's cobwebs everywhere. There was an empty bowl at his feet that had mac and cheese in it, and he didn't want to eat this mac and cheese, obviously, but he didn't want to anger his kidnapper either. And he thinks of the word kidnapped. The word turned his stomach. He was just like the kids on the milk cartons now. A door opens, and the boy jolts against the sides of the crate. As the man approaches, he's no longer in a security guard uniform. He is in a tank top, slacks, and cowboy boots. And he says, "Don't worry, kid. I'm not a pervert." And the boy closes his eyes tight. And I'm not going to hurt you unless you make me. Are you going to be a good boy or a bad boy? The boy sniffled, and the man said, "You best answer me." As the boy chokes on his words, he says, "I'll be good." The man says that when he was a kid, he had to work hard on the farm. He had to chop off chicken heads, fix fences, and dig ditches. The boy closes his eyes and holds his sobs into his chest. And the man says that if he complained, he'd get the belt. "You don't want the belt, boy. Believe me. I've got bumps on my ass. Ain't never gonna heal. I don't want to be hard on you the way Pa was hard on me. I don't want to hurt you, but you gotta remember, you're here to work. Not cry, not argue, not try and run away. Just work." The man asks if they understand each other, and the boy tries to answer, but only whimpers come out, and he is afraid that the man is going to be upset at his fear or his emotion. The man's tone turns almost gentle and fatherly, and he says, "I know you're scared, this being your first day and all. Just nod if you agree." The boy did. And he said, "Now just relax and calm down. There won't be no chores today. You show me you're going to behave, and I'll bring down a cot for you to sleep on, get you out of this here cage. But we have to grow a trust, you and me. That starts today." It cuts to some time later, and it says, pigs. They were everywhere. Rolling, snorting, squealing in a black pit of mud and waste. The stink was monstrous, reminding the boy of a campground's porta potty. The man led him around this pig pen, and he sees the house that he was just inside of, much smaller than he thought. And he sees a tin shack and some kind of barn. The entire perimeter of the farm is covered with thicket and poison ivy and bramble. And there was a rifle in the man's truck, meaning that the boy thought he was probably a hunter. He knew these woods. The boy didn't. The truck sat along a dirt road leading to the farmhouse. The boy could attempt to follow the dirt road, but it could lead him nowhere or just make him even more lost. Maybe if he were good, the man would let him go home. Maybe if he completed all the chores, the man would let him go home. But it never occurred to him that a farm's chores are ongoing, that maintenance was never completed. They stepped around a generator and went inside the tin shack. It was cool, damp, and the silver sheen reflected their warped images back at them, and the boy dropped his eyes as to not see his own face. It would look too much like the kids on the milk cartons. Against the wall, there were 2 machines with cords that ran down them. One was a steel tub with a pipe extending from the bottom, the end of which was capped by a grate with small holes. Beneath the pipe was a bucket. The other machine was a metal table with a steel bar above it like a gallows. Running down from it was a saw blade connected to the table, pieces of dried meat, still clinging to the menace of its teeth. The man says, "This is the bone saw, and this is the meat grinder. I'm going to teach you how to take them apart, clean them, and put them back together. That's where this will start." We switch back to Chuck's perspective, and he is ogling at a teenage girl getting off of the school bus out of his apartment window. And he thinks that he was middle-aged now. He would never be with a girl that young again. And to them, he may as well be a mummified eunuch shitting himself in a wheelchair. But they couldn't stop him from looking. She had to be new, he thought. He hadn't seen her before. He knew why he enjoyed watching these teenage girls. It was more than dirty old man syndrome. These girls were the ones he'd known so intimately in his youth, the ones who'd made him a man. He only wanted to touch them again, to brush their hair as he once had, and caress them until the sorrow seeped out of their flesh, freeing them for a brief but magic moment. Chuck leaves his apartment, and as he's walking down the street, he picks up a still-lit cigarette butt and begins puffing on it. And just then, near the dumpster, there was a shape sitting there. And then there was a sound like a skateboard. There was a homeless man with some sort of disability with his legs, rolling on a wooden platform with grocery cart wheels screwed into the bottom as a sort of makeshift mobility aid. And despite the heat, he was dressed in layers, wearing a patchy winter coat and a trucker hat that read, "Date sluts, 'cause that's all there is." He also has a flask with the Confederate flag on it, and he makes sure to say that he doesn't care about the flag, he just found the flask. He offers Chuck a drink off of his flask, and he takes it. The man said, "Folks call me Shitty." Chuck says, "That's your name, Shitty?" He says, "Has been longer than my birth name was." Chuck introduces himself and says that he's about to go to the bar, and that Shitty should join him. Shitty says that he's not usually allowed in bars, mostly because of how he smells, but also probably because of his disability. Chuck takes Shitty to the bar and introduces him to Barman. And Barman kind of scowls at Shitty a little bit, but agrees to let him stay. But he says that he's going to have to spray him first, and pulls out some air freshener. And this homeless man just giggles as he's being sprayed with air freshener. They order drinks, and Eugene arrives, and the first thing he says is, "People are dying." Chuck thinks that Eugene is just going on another spiel about something that doesn't matter, and he says, "Don't tell me it's just another one of my delusions. It's on the news." Chuck says he doesn't have a TV and he doesn't read the papers, so. Shitty says that he knows about the virus and that Eugene isn't lying. Barman turned back and said, "The Scream?" Eugene said, "Yeah, that's it. That's what they're calling it now. The Scream." Shitty said, "I've seen it." The other men turned toward him, and Eugene said, "Like, in person?" And Shitty says, "Yeah, a week or so ago, Rita done got it. She's a bag lady, you know, hangs around downtown selling friendship bracelets. Word was she was acting strange. Someone said she had rabies, and he saw her on the street just running." Shitty wheeled himself in front of Rita to see what was going on and why she was running, but instead of stopping, she just kept running and launched herself over Shitty, knocking herself onto the concrete and knocking out a bunch of her teeth. And as Shitty tries to see if she's okay as she lays there on her side, he sees pus in the corners of her eyes. The white parts of her eyes were completely red. He asked if she was okay, and she just got up and started screaming. And she grabbed onto a parking meter and started ripping out her hair, just screaming over and over, screaming like she was being stabbed. Eugene said, "What happened then?" Shitty said, "I don't know. She was still screaming when I rolled off. Nothing I could do, and she scared me." Eugene asks if an ambulance came or anything, and Shitty says, "Are you kidding? She's homeless." After a brief silence, Barman said, "Maybe they're right. Maybe she is just crazy." Eugene said, "Come on, you heard him say she had the pus in her eyes and the jaundiced skin. Those are the symptoms." Chuck asked how he hasn't heard about this, and Barman says Chuck wouldn't know his dick was cut off unless he found it floating in a glass of booze. And Chuck says true, but still. Eugene says there's 250 confirmed cases in the Northeast alone, not to mention thousands in Canada. It's becoming an epidemic. If it spreads in cities like this, it could become a pandemic. Eugene said we need to be extra careful. They don't know if it's airborne or a virus or carried by insects or if it's some kind of neurological phenomenon like an aneurysm. So, obviously, because they have no idea what causes it, there is no cure. When Chuck asks if this means it's fatal, Eugene says, "In a matter of speaking." Barman said, "For once, Gene is right. They said on the news that once you start screaming, you can't stop. You can't eat because you can't chew while you're screaming. And you can't go to sleep either, so you slowly go more insane until you just drop dead from exhaustion. But most cases end in suicide before that happens." Chuck says, "Jesus Christ." And Shitty claps his hands and says, "Praise the Lord." We go to chapter 6, which is once again the perspective of the boy. The boy is forking hay in the loft of the barn. We don't know how long he's been here, but we do know that his hands are blistered and peeled, and his whole body ached, so obviously he's been working here a while. As he is in the loft of the barn, doing his job, he sees the man out the window, who is in the mud pit with the pigs. And the boy wonders, why is he naked? The boy had witnessed bizarre behavior recently from the man, but what was most alarming was the mold-like discoloration on the bottom of his calves and his feet. The skin had a green hue and was peppered with small open sores. Wouldn't they get infected if he kept frolicking through hog waste? The thought made the boy feel queasy. As the boy thought about how he would never see his parents again, he would never play with his dog again, and he would never ride bikes with his friends again, he hears a horrible squeal from outside. And the most detail that I will go into is that the man is SAing a pig. The book goes into much more detail than that. The boy accidentally locks eyes with the man through the window, and the man smiles and waves at the boy as he continues and shouts the word love. Chapter 7 switches back to Chuck's perspective. He is at Leslie's apartment. She is drunk on the couch, practically unconscious, and he's kind of trying to rouse her into having sex. She is obviously too drunk and kind of snappy anyway, so he decides he's going to take his booze and leave. She gets into an argument with him, and as the neighbors are yelling out of their windows, Leslie goes to yell back, and Chuck has to physically pull her back from the window. And she says to Chuck, "Take me to dinner. I want french fries." Chuck says, "It's late. Everything's closed." She says, "Nuh-uh, the diner's open till like 2. Chuck sighed and thinks that she's just going to go by herself and get hit by a car or something anyway, so he might as well go with her. He tells her to get dressed, and she puts on a Texas Chainsaw Massacre t-shirt. As they get out onto the street, they see a gaggle of rats scurrying past them. Chuck said, "They're taking over." As they arrive at the diner, Leslie says, after the waitress had walked away, that she just wants to be filled up. Chuck says, "With fries?" Leslie says no, she means all filled up, everywhere, not just her stomach. Chuck says he's not sure what she means, and Leslie puts her hand under the table on the inside of his leg. And she says that she wants her belly and her mouth full of food, her lungs full of smoke, her bladder full of vodka, and her privates full of him. Chuck nodded as he started to understand. He said, "Full." Leslie said, "All filled up. No more holes, Chucky. No more voids. No more fucking emptiness." There was a quiver in her voice, a soft sadness hidden beneath the vulgarity. And after their french fries had come out, Leslie gives him a hand job under the table, and he finishes onto a handful of french fries, and she eats them. And then we cut to sometime later. Chuck is at his apartment complex collecting his mail downstairs, and he sees the blonde teenager that he was creepily looking at out the window a few chapters ago. He thought that she wore too much makeup, but she made it work. She said hey to him, and her voice was a butterscotch kiss. Her batting eyelashes the soft teeth of a Venus flytrap sucking him in to be devoured. This guy is just so much. It describes this vulgar fantasy that Chuck has about this teenage girl that he has seen a total of 2 times. And she asked if he smokes. He reached for his pack of cigarettes, and I mean like weed. And he said, no, why, do you need some? She said, I'm dying for a joint. And the girl says that ever since her parents moved her here, she hasn't been able to score anything but dirt weed, and no one around this town trusts her yet because she's new. Chuck had trouble believing that a girl this pretty couldn't get what she wanted, but he decided to help her. He tells her that he knows a guy, and she says, cool, can we meet him today? Chuck says, no, he's kind of paranoid. I'll get it for you. And it says she was everything he wasn't, a kitten in a picnic basket to his mangy bobcat living in a shithouse. He could never hope to hook up with her, but maybe if he became her dope hookup, he could talk her into sending a few nudes or something like that. It was still too early to know if she would do something like that, but Chuck thinks that based on the fact that she asked basically a complete stranger, middle-aged man for pot, that made Chuck think she might be a troubled girl. Troubled girls were always easier. She asked how much it'll cost. Haven't you ever seen an after-school special? The first one's always free. Chuck goes to knock on Eugene's apartment, and Eugene also lives with his mother. He's a mid-30s, early 40s man living with his mother. Chuck is smoking a cigarette in the hallway as Eugene opens the door. He says, some people are allergic. You can't do that. Chuck says, you're allergic to everything. Eugene's mother called from somewhere in the apartment to close the door. Eugene barely opens the door enough to slither out and talk to Chuck. Chuck says he needs some pot. And Eugene scans the hallway and says, shit, keep it down, would ya? They could be listening. He says, who, the neighbors? Eugene says, no, the feds, the DEA. Any government agency could have this place tapped. Chuck didn't argue. He needed something from Eugene. So he played nice. And he said, fine, let's go over to my place. Eugene said, one sec. Eugene went back into the apartment, closed the door for a minute, mumbled to his mother, and then came back out. As they enter Chuck's apartment, Eugene recoils at the smell of cigarettes, and also at the messy state of the apartment. There were empty liquor bottles on every table. The garbage can was overflowing with wrappers and pizza boxes. Eugene says, you know, unsanitary conditions like this lead to vermin. Because we had such a warm winter and such a hot summer, the rats were able to stay active longer and reproduce more frequently. Now with this garbage strike, they're having a field day. Chuck shrugged and said, let them. Eugene says, some say the rats could be carriers of the scream. Chuck says, why, are there rats that are screaming? Eugene says, no, but they don't have to show signs to carry the virus. I think it's viral, don't you? Chuck says, I think I want my weed. Eugene says, how much do you want? Chuck says, couple of joints. As Eugene starts rolling, he says that chick you're banging across the hall, Leslie, she's nuts. She makes more noise than a dump truck. Drives my ma right up the wall. Chuck admits Leslie has problems. Eugene says she's a raging alcoholic. That's her problem. That or she's diseased, like most people. They were saying online that this scream is like the bubonic plague, like a long-lost disease, coming back to haunt us, making everybody crazy. Eugene says women are the nuts anyway, though. They've always got to make drama, be the star of their own little soap opera. That's why he's single. Chuck allowed his friend this delusion of grandeur, knowing that it was women who refused to date Eugene, not the other way around. Eugene asks Chuck for a drink, and just as he's about to get him one, there's the sound of a door slamming in the hallway, immediately followed by yelling. It was a man. Not yelling at someone, not yelling words, just screaming as if in terror. His cries were raw and guttural, enough to make Chuck's skin prickle. And then they hear footsteps, and it sounded like a bison thundering across an open range. Pounding shook the walls. Eugene paled and said, "Oh my God." There's the sound of glass shattering, and more stomping, and more screaming. Chuck heads to the door, and Eugene says, "Don't open it." Chuck says he wants to know what's going on. Eugene says, "It's the scream." Chuck opens the door, and Eugene ducks behind Chuck's kitchen counter very intelligently. He put the neck of his t-shirt over his nose and mouth like a mask in case it was airborne. At the end of the hall, a heavy-set black man in his underwear was rampaging, kicking holes in the wall, not seeming angry, but rather in a state of horror. A hint of yellow was visible on his flesh, as if he'd been sprayed with pollen. Blood ran from his knuckles and dribbled down the dents he'd made in the drywall. A small, skinny woman was pleading with him to stop, but too frightened to get close. Chuck steps out into the hall and asks her what the problem is. The woman looked at him with tears in her eyes and said, "My husband hasn't slept in days and he won't stop screaming." Chuck could barely hear her, so he got close to her. The husband screaming was too loud. He asked, "Did you call the cops?" She said, "No, he's got prior convictions. They'll just put him away." Chuck says, "Maybe we should call the paramedics." The wife says, "He's just tired." Chuck says, "Lady, he's gone berserk," as the husband is slamming his head repeatedly against the railing of the stairs. The wife says, "He ain't crazy, he's just..." And a deafening howl cuts her off as her husband dives down the staircase as if into a swimming pool, head first, arms out at his sides like wings. Now it was the wife who screamed. The sound was so gentle, like an egg hitting a tile floor. Blood poured from every hole in his face. His brain matter was coming out of his ears, and his kneecap was jutting out of the torn flesh of one of his legs. As the wife sobs at the bottom of the staircase, inconsolably, as her husband is carried away, and Chuck sat watching her, watching the officers, the photographers, the coroners. Half of the complex had come out to see the commotion, and even Eugene had come out at this point. One of the paramedics says that he believes it was an aneurysm, and they'll know more later, and he starts to leave. Chuck follows this paramedic outside and says it wasn't an aneurysm. That guy went apeshit. And the paramedic said it's hard to know the cause at this point. Chuck leaned in and said, "It's the scream, ain't it?" The medic looks away. Chuck pressures the medic to try to reveal more about what he knows about this, because surely he's seen more than one case. The medic is trying to deflect him. Chuck says, "Come on, I'm not trying to bust your balls. I just want to know if it's safe here. If it's not, then I can try to leave." And the paramedic says, "Leave and go where?" There's reports north and south of here, from Maine to the Carolinas. The worst of it is north, but it's still spreading. And the paramedic says that a lot of these cases are ending in sewer slide. He says the craziest part is it's not normal sewer slides either. No one's overdosing on pills or using guns to do it. They are jumping in front of buses and diving down staircases. The paramedic also says that there's no cases of it taking over whole families or workplaces or people who are all in the same building, so it doesn't seem to be contagious in a normal way. It's just one person at a time, at random. Chuck says, "My friend was saying something about it being like an old disease, like the plague, coming back from the past." And the medic sighed and said, "If someone does have the answer, they sure haven't shared it with us." Chapter 8 switches back to the perspective of the boy, and the boy is being told by the man that it is his first time being required to feed the veal, and The boy is instantly terrified about this, and he tells the man he doesn't even know how to do it. You're going to have to learn sometime. The man gives him 2 bottles of formula and sends him off into what is not even dawn. The farm is dark and terrifying, as always, but especially in the dark. The boy made his way to the tin shack where the veal were, and he already heard them braying and crying. He pauses at the doorway of this shack, unable to get himself to open the door, and he notices that the symphony of crickets had quieted. Finally, he took the handle, surprised by its warmth, and inserted the key into the padlock. And before the door was even open, the veal were screaming. The boy flicked on a bulb that dangled from the ceiling by a chain. It stank in this shack. It smelled like bodily fluids of all kinds. And it was also very warm, even at nighttime, the heat of the day being trapped inside. It was a wonder the veal could survive this temperature. It was a wonder they could survive at all, given their hellish living conditions. The blonde one shook against her chains. "Please help us," she cried. "Please, little boy, get us out of here." He couldn't look her in the eye. And the one in the next cage was chained so tightly she couldn't turn to face him. She cried to him without even looking at him. But what could he do? He was slightly better off than they were, but he was still a prisoner of this man. He put down his satchel and took one of the formula bottles and moved towards the blonde. Her cage was so small she had to tuck down into a cannonball to fit into it. Her wrists and ankles were pinned to the grated concrete floor by chains only 3 lengths long. The man told him that demobilizing them diminished their muscle mass, which would keep the meat tender. The veal was not to be starved, but it was to never get any exercise. They couldn't even stretch, lie down, or turn over. And judging by the state of their crates, it appeared that they weren't allowed out at all. The blonde whispered, "You have to help me." The boy's eyes watered, and he said, "I can't." And he feeds her with this formula bottle, unable to do anything to free herself, giving in to her complete helplessness to this situation. The boy returns to the house, and the man is proud of him, and he says that he wants to cook him something special because of a job well done. The boy has only been eating canned soup and PB&Js for an indeterminate amount of time, so this is a nice offer. And the boy begins to say, "Some bacon and eggs would be..." The man cuts him off, slams both fists on the table, and says, "No pork will ever touch your fork. You understand me, boy?" The boy closed his eyes and nodded. And the man is not done. He said, "You think because this is a pig farm, I'm going to make bacon and pork chops. That's what everyone thinks. They don't know the kind of man I am. I used to work at a pork processing plant. You're scared of me? You should see what pig slaughtering is like." Continues to describe very horrible things about slaughterhouses. And this man is very, very adamant about caring about these pigs and how they're beautiful animals and how they're taken from their parents right after being born and just used by people and discarded. And he says they all die screaming. And the man looked away with tears in his eyes, one of the only times he's shown this level of vulnerability. And as tears roll down the man's face, he says, "Do you still want your bacon, kid?" He shook his head no. He said, "Yeah, you're learning, kid. You're learning." Chapter 9, back to Chuck's perspective, says that they brought 2 bags of Arby's back to Leslie's place. They have a intimate moment that involves an Arby's sandwich, and at the end of this, Leslie says, "I'm falling in love with you." The doorbell rings sometime later as they are having a different intimate moment. Leslie wants to ignore the doorbell ring. Chuck says, "I think I know who it is," and gets up to answer it. And it was the teenage girl in the hallway. and she has pigtails and a tube top and cut off shorts, and she looks younger than she probably is. And Chuck likes this. She said, I didn't know how to get a hold of you, so I just dropped by. And Chuck wonders how she even knew which apartment was his. Leslie is looking at this girl like an opponent in a boxing ring. The girl said, I'm not interrupting, am I? Chuck says, no, you're good, come in. He said, say, I don't even know your name. She said, it's Brittany. Chuck hands Brittany the joints from Eugene, and Leslie says, you had grass and didn't share it with me? Chuck says, I didn't know you wanted any. Leslie says, that's not the point. Brittany looks uncomfortable, and Leslie says, you hear that poor bastard died the other day? She said, I heard about it when I got home from school. Leslie says, school, huh? How old are you? She says, 17. Leslie turned to Chuck and said, old enough for you, huh, Chucky? Brittany got red in the face and said she should go. She didn't mean to bother them. Leslie said, yeah, you should. We adults have better things to do than deal dope to kiddies. Chuck groaned and said, shut up, Les. Brittany said, thanks again, I owe you one. And Leslie yells out something vulgar out the door as Brittany's leaving. After Chuck shuts the door, he says, gee, Les, like her much? Leslie asks if he's gonna hook up with her. Chuck says, first chance he gets. Leslie says, men. All they care about is getting their dicks wet. Chuck said, not true. I also care about getting drunk and smoking cigarettes. What about me, Chuck? What about me? They start having another intimate moment with a block of cheese, and Chuck asks her why she brought up the dead guy. She said, what, one interesting thing happens and I'm not supposed to talk about it? You're the one who told me. Leslie says she doesn't need a disease to make her jump out of windows. Chuck says, what? She shows him some scars on her arms and said that they are from a sewer slide attempt about a year ago. She didn't have this scream that people are talking about, but she was screaming. Chuck thought he should take her hand, but he didn't. He said, why'd you do it? Leslie says, forget it. Chuck says, come on, Les, tell me what happened. She said, why do you care? You're not my boyfriend or anything. Chuck said, I still care. Leslie shoots back some vodka and goes into a story. She used to have a decent job and a decent house and a decent family with a husband and 2 kids, a little boy and a little girl. Her husband, Wayne, started having very bad problems with mental health and was in and out of inpatient hospital stays and behavioral health facilities. And she had to still work, too, obviously, to keep them with a roof over their heads. And she began to really resent her husband for this. And every time he would go back to the hospital, she would just resent him more and more. And she would think that he's just laying around there because he's sad while she has to do all the work. That's how she started looking at it. So this guy at the bank she worked at started flirting with her during this time. First, they just went out for drinks while her mother was babysitting the kids. But soon enough, she was going to his place. She knew it was a rotten thing to do, but she had needs. Wayne had become more like a third kid than a husband. Then Leslie's hands started shaking as she told this story. So she said she started having sex with Terry. And they would usually do it on their lunch break from the bank. And they would sometimes do it at this burger restaurant down the street. One day they are going at it in the bathroom, and a woman and child accidentally walk in because they forgot to lock the door. I guess it was a single stall. The manager comes running over, there's a waitress calling 911, and they are both arrested. And Leslie had no idea that hooking up in a public place could have such severe legal implications. She thought that if it was two consenting adults, that it would just kind of be like a warning and then get out of here. But no, they were put on a registry for this, her and Terry. And while she was in jail, she had one phone call to make, and she could either call her mother or call her husband. Either way, one of those people would know the whole truth. But she thought she wouldn't be able to hide it from her husband anyway because of being on a registry now. So she called her husband and came clean. She told him everything. And Wayne, who had been doing increasingly better around this time, he had not been in the hospital for a considerable amount of time, and it seemed like his mental health was really doing better. This phone call breaks him. Leslie thought that this phone call, her coming clean, might be the Hail Mary to save their relationship, and that there was a small chance he could just forgive her, but that is not what happened. Um, he just went catatonic. He didn't talk to her anymore. He didn't talk to the kids anymore. He didn't do anything. And it was worse than it ever was. And Leslie was begging him to react, to get angry with her, to fight with her, to try to save their relationship, or at least try to defend himself as a person. And when he did none of those things, it made her so angry that she exploded on him. He was a wimp and a coward and a crybaby, and that she went to another man for a reason, and it was because of him. And that he was a bad husband and a worse father. And Wayne sat there and took it all. He didn't say a word to her. Leslie threw a clock at his head and left to go to work. Leslie, in the present day, telling this story to Chuck, puffs on her cigarette and wipes tears from her face. She said, "That was the same day I jumped out the window. I got home from work, and nobody answered when I said I'm home. The kids didn't come running. I thought maybe my yelling at Wayne snapped him out of it and he took them to the park or something." She went upstairs to change, and on her bed were all three members of her family, Wayne and her two children, snuggled together on the bed. And for a brief moment, she felt this immense love for all of them, thinking that they were taking a nap. But they weren't. Wayne had taken all of them out of this world. And so she jumped through the upstairs window, through the glass and everything. Chuck was unable to look at Leslie as she said this. He knew that no words would suffice. He just listened. Leslie said she broke her leg, got a concussion, and cut up, but God didn't let her die. She found out later that Wayne had fed them rat poison for lunch. How's that for getting back at your wife for cheating, huh? How's that for depressed? Didn't leave no note or nothing. I knew he was fucked up, but I never would have thought he could do something like that. Never to the kids. And she tells him to be a doll and take her memories away. Later that night, Chuck took Leslie to the bar. She actually dressed up a little bit for once, wearing a little bit of makeup and everything, and Chuck was actually proud to have her on his arm, something he could show off. Shitty is at the bar and says hi to Chuck. Eugene also walks over and says, "Hey." Chuck introduced Eugene to Leslie officially, and to his amazement, Eugene shook her hand. He must have been willing to do anything to touch a woman. "Well," Chuck said, "look at germaphobe Gene here, actually making skin contact with another human being." Barman said, "Heard about your stair diver. What a freak show this city is. Goddamn human zoo if I ever saw one." Shitty said that all of America is trash. He's been traveling all over for his whole life, and they're pretty much all the same. "People think I'm the one who lives in garbage," he says. "But guess what? We all do. I'm just smart enough to live free while I'm in it. That's what makes me a true American." Barman crossed his arms and said, "You sleep in a gutter and shit in a storm drain." Shitty says, "I'm a patriot." Leslie whispers to Chuck under the music, "These psychos are your friends?" Chuck says, "Don't be anxious, you'll fit right in." She says, "Very funny," and sipped her vodka. "You sure know how to treat a lady taking me to a fancy place like this. I thought we were going to go out to eat, Chucky, someplace nice for a change, like a real date." Chuck said, "I just thought we'd start with an eye-opener." Eugene starts talking about the scream. He says that there's more reports and there's screamers turning up everywhere. Barman says, no big loss. He says, too many people in this city for me to miss anybody. Barman says, it's almost as good as never having children. I was watching the news earlier, and all of the polar ice caps are melting, and the Amazon is burning away, and thousands are dying in heat waves. We're in a global crisis, and no one's doing anything to fix it. A good mass death is just what we need to cool the planet down. Leslie begins to ask Chuck where they're going to go next, and she is interrupted by a scream. One of the Italian men at the bar was climbing onto the table that he had been sitting at. He turned on his back, kicking his legs in the air like a child mid-tantrum. The man begins ripping out his own hair, trickles of blood sliding down his face. One of his friends tries to grab his hands and remove them from his head, but it doesn't work. Chuck thinks that maybe he should help. Maybe Barman will give him a job if he does. And Leslie says, are you stupid? The scream is infectious. Two of the prostitutes who were sitting at the table with this Italian man are trying to run out of the building. But just before they get out the door, one of them falls to the ground and starts screaming. She ran around in circles, swatting the air as if being chased by hornets. The change was so sudden it made Chuck's breath stop. The girl's friend has given up on trying to save her and is scurrying backwards to try to leave. Then the screaming Italian man broke free of those holding him down, and he leaps into the air and crashes into the screaming prostitute. And they start doing a violent dance, twirling and punching and kicking and snapping, a cyclone of raging flesh and bone, just ripping each other apart. The Italian man's friend tries to separate them, but is headbutted and his nose is smashed. And as everybody in the bar is kind of just watching, some filming on their phones, Chuck notices that as these screamers are swinging at each other, it doesn't appear that they're trying to block or defend themselves from the other's attacks at all, like a person would do. It appeared that the screamers' only defense was offense, meaning that they just swung over and over, just swinging and ripping and tearing, pummeling and biting. For some reason, this brunette woman was seemingly just as physically strong as the Italian man she was fighting. Just then, the screaming woman sticks her thumbnails into the man's eyes, and Chuck hears them pop. Another man in the crowd vomited at the sight of one of the eyeballs being pushed out of the socket and squeezed in the hooker's fist. She twirled her fingers around the connective tissue, getting a good enough grip to tug it free from the skull, and Barman attempted to hit the screaming men with a bar stool to get him off of the hooker. But the screamer backhanded Barman into a table, hard enough to break it. Chuck tried to help again, but Leslie clutched him tighter, and that's when the other Italian man started screaming. Chapter 10 goes back to the boy's perspective. She was too old to be veal. The boy knew that. He'd been taught that. So why was she here? The man pushed the woman into the corner of the shed. He said, "Bitch done caught me." The boy said, "What do you mean?" He said, "There's a fresh piece of veal in pen number 4. I thought she was alone, but her mom was watching in the parking lot. So when I made my move, she raised hell, and I had to gas her too." That's what the man called it when he knocked people out, just like he did with the boy. How many years ago was it now? There was no calendar here. All the boy knew was that he was taller and stronger, and he had body hair. He had pimples and had grown out of the clothes he came here in. Now he wore mostly hand-me-downs from the girls the man had kidnapped. The jeans were usually too tight, so he'd taken to wearing their dresses instead. It bothered him at first, but the soft material in the breeze made him enjoy them. The man makes the woman undress, and once she was nude, he had her stand up. She tried to cover herself with her hands, but the man smacked them away. The man tells the boy that it is his job to shave this veal, and for some reason the man is insistent that the boy shaves her head as well, even though the only parts of the head that they could use were the cheeks, ears, and nose. The scalp was virtually worthless. but the boy knew better than to ask questions while working. As the boy shaves off the woman's hair, she cries. He finished, and the man tells him to sit down. The boy wonders if he forgot something or did something wrong. The man said, "Do you know that card that was in your pocket when I first met you?" And the boy said, "I think so." The man said, "I held on to it. It was an ID card from your school. It had your birthday on it." He said, "July 31st. That's today. You turned 13 today, kid." The boy felt hollow when he heard this. 13. He had been here for 4 years. The man goes on to say about how when he was a kid, his father would make him come along on hunting trips, but never allow him to shoot a gun. And as a child, he was very eager to shoot, but his father was insistent that he wasn't ready. He was only allowed to shoot bottles at first. And he says that all those years he thought he was just his father's mule. The old man was teaching him. He wanted me to be the right age and the right state of mind. He handed the rifle over to me when I was old enough, and I shot a big buck on my 13th birthday. The man withdraws his hunting knife from a sheath on his belt, hands it to the boy, and says, "Happy birthday, kid." Chapter 11 goes back to Chuck and Leslie, who have just escaped out of the emergency exit of the bar. Barman, Shitty, and a prostitute named Angel also escape. Barman says he shouldn't leave Rudy's place. He's responsible for this bar. He says that he'll just wait here until the cops show up. But as a siren squeals, a police car races directly past them. Barman says they just kept driving. Eugene is looking at social media on his phone to see everybody posting videos of screamers all over the city. They smell something burning, and they decide to go to Leslie's apartment. Leslie doesn't exactly want everybody in her apartment, but she figures that maybe they'll be safer in numbers. Even Shitty might be able to bite an ankle or twist a pair of testicles. Chuck said, "Okay then, party at our place." Chapter 12 goes back to the boy. The man says, "Well, what you waiting for?" The boy couldn't take a step in the woman's direction. The man put his hands on his hips and said, "Time to man up, kid. Ain't gotta be savage. Don't go all stab crazy. Just pull her head back by her hair and cut her throat. Go deep. Gotta hit the jugular." The woman's sobs grew louder. The man says, "That's how humans slaughter pigs. Why should we get any different treatment?" The man says in a kind tone, "I know it's a big step, but I believe in you, kid." The boy says, "Thank you, sir." And the woman says, "Please, I'm a mom. I just had a baby." There was a time that would have mattered to the boy, but not now. Just before the boy is about to finish the job, he notices something leaking from the woman's chest. And the man says, "Guess she wasn't lying about having a baby." The boy frowned in disgust. He knew that sows breastfed their young, but humans? The man gets down onto his knees and drinks from this woman. He said, "This is what we all live on when we're born. Mother's milk is nature's perfect food." He also says that he breastfed until he was about 10 or 11. And the man says, "We're going to have to keep this one alive. She could feed us for a long time." And the boy puts the hunting knife on the table with a somewhat disappointed look on his face. And the man says, "Oh, don't give me them puppy dog eyes. Go get us some veal. The new girl will do." The woman screamed, and the man kicked her in the stomach. The boy always wanted to help the veal before. He felt like he was the same as them, a prisoner, but he didn't think of himself that way anymore. The man had allowed him to have an actual room in the house. He had free reign. He was no longer terrified of this man, although he knew that just one look from the man could put that fear back into him. The boy had tried to make friends with the veal early on, but they never seemed to want to talk anyway. He had pitied them. In a way, he still did, but he had also grown desensitized to young women chained to the floor in dog crates too small for them. He unlocks a cage and takes the veal by the arms. She said, "What's happening? Where's my mom?" The boy reaches for a cattle prod, and the sound that came out of the girl upon her first shock was almost pig-like, but not enough. Back to Chuck's perspective. As they try to get back to the apartment, they pass dented trash cans overflowing with rotting waste, and there are ambulances in the middle of the street. And there are abandoned cars strewn throughout the street. People were running between the cars, some screamers, other people pleading with them. There were clusters of fists and kicking legs, a wrench connecting with a skull, a woman's high heel thrust into an eye socket. Shitty said, "It's like a prison riot." Chuck said, "Forget the cops, we need the National Guard." "Question is," Barman said, "why are so many people turning at the same time? First it was almost nobody, and now it's in droves." Eugene kept his voice low and said, "The second phase. It didn't happen for no reason. It can't be random." Leslie tells him to stop trying to freak everyone out. They hear a scream in the night, and a child pounces out of a doorway and tumbles into the street. He wore only a pair of Hulk underwear, his knees scraped and bloody, his hair a briar speckled with litter. Running at full speed, he screeched and repeatedly punched himself in the face, his cheeks and forehead pink from the onslaught. Shitty choked on his words and said, "Oh no." Chuck said, "What do we do?" to no one in particular. Barman said, "There's nothing we can do." Eugene said, "Unless we want to kill him and put him out of his misery." Barman said, "What are you going to do, Gene? Beat him with a trash can? You can't just kill every screamer. What if there's a cure in the works? These people could get better." Angel, the prostitute, says, "He's just a little boy." Eugene's eyes darted, and he said, "I didn't mean to, really do it or anything. I was just thinking out loud. Besides, Barman, when did you get so philanthropic? Thought you wanted a plague." "Shit," Barman said as he hung his head. "That was just bullshit talk. I don't know." Leslie was crying, silently. Chuck asks if she's okay, but she started mumbling something he couldn't make out, and started walking toward the boy. Chuck grabbed her arm. He was about to tell her not to do it, because she could get hurt, but before he even had the chance to, she had already given up. The screaming boy dashed into the street, jumped onto the hood of a car, and used it as a trampoline. The man behind the wheel put his hands over his face, crying, then fled from the car, abandoning it as the child roared into the wind, no longer human. The group decides to stop by a liquor store on their way to the apartment, which is owned by a man named Nishant. Chuck knows Nishant pretty well, and he walks in and says, "Hey, Nishant, you in there?" But the sound of a pump-action shotgun caused Chuck to step back. Nishant's face appeared behind the iron bars, eyes tight. "What do you want?" Chuck smiled and said, "Just some booze, man. You know me. I come in all the time." Nishant looks at the others and said, "Who are these people?" He says, "Just some friends." Nishant says, "Hand me the money through the bars, and do it slowly." Everybody pooled together what little money they had, and Chuck offered for Nishant to come to the apartment complex with them. Nishant said he appreciates it, but he has to protect what's his. There was a loud pop as a transformer exploded across the street. The power line started hissing sparks as it came flailing to the ground. When Chuck turned back around, Nishant seemed very startled, and he had the gun pointed at the group once again. He said, "Get out of here. I don't want to shoot you, but I will." Shitty got rolling and started waving his arm for everyone to follow him. Everyone started leaving, except for Eugene. "Don't you see this is what they want?" Eugene said. Nishant told him to move. Eugene said, "They want us to turn on each other, man. This is part of their master plan." Barman said, "Gene, come on, this is not the time." "But it is." Eugene turned back to Nishant a little too quickly and stepped too close. From what Chuck could tell, Eugene thought he was going to enlighten him, but it seemed that Nishant thought it was a threat. The shotgun blast deafened Chuck, and he couldn't even hear Angel screaming beside him. Wet pieces of something hit his forehead and cheeks. Time seemed to slow down. Eugene's face all but disintegrated from the peppering of pellets. It looked like his skin was melting away and defying gravity as it rose up and away from his skull in a red mist. Nishant panicked and fled deeper into the store. Barman rushed to Eugene's side. "We're leaving," he called out. "Don't shoot. I'm going to help him up." Barman lifted one of Eugene's arms over his neck and scowled at Chuck. "Help me, you moron." Chuck was still holding the booze bottles. He uses his other arm to help with Eugene. And at this point, you're starting to understand that alcohol is very important to Chuck, and that's probably not good. Eugene certainly felt dead when Chuck was helping carry him. He was heavy and limp, a real pain in the ass as always. As they dragged him away from the store, Barman barked at the women, "Move your asses, I can't carry all of you." Chuck couldn't help but laugh. He felt Barman's eyes on him, but he couldn't see them because it was blocked by Eugene's lack of face. Eugene's head kept drooping to Chuck's side, the shredded flesh sticking to his shoulder. As they moved along, Shitty was already waiting up ahead on the corner, drinking out of the gin bottle. Who could blame him, Chuck thought. They get back to the apartment complex, and they struggle to get Eugene up the stairs, avoiding the elevator because it's most likely not working. Chuck almost wished Eugene had died so they wouldn't have to break their backs getting him to the apartment. Chuck didn't think he was callous for thinking this way. Eugene was almost certainly going to die anyway. Barman said, "We have to get him to a hospital." But the way he said it made it sound like he knew that was pointless. He said, "With the city in this kind of chaos, hospitals are bound to be bedlam." Chuck said, "Overcrowded with the screamers and their families." Barman starts tending to Eugene's wounds on the couch, and Chuck helps by putting a vodka-soaked rag upon the mush that had been his face. He almost expected Eugene to wake up from the sting of the alcohol on his wounds, but he didn't. If it wasn't for his chest slowly rising and falling, he wouldn't think he's alive. Leslie pulls Chuck aside to talk. She says, "I don't know what we're doing." He says, "What do you mean?" Leslie says, "What's the plan?" Chuck thought it was just like a woman to expect a man to have everything figured out even when things are this crazy. He looked at his own shoes and shook his head. Leslie said, "There's no plan, is there, Chucky? We're just holed up in here waiting to die." Chuck says, "Don't be so dramatic." Leslie says, "Are you going to tell me I'm wrong? The world's collapsing out there. Even the ones who aren't screamers are shooting at us. And the cops are so busy, people can probably do whatever they want now. Crime is free of charge now." Chuck says, "You make it sound kind of fun." Leslie said, "Is that supposed to be funny? Because I'm not laughing. Your friend over there doesn't have a face." Chuck put his hands on her shoulders and tried to calm her down. He said, "As long as the madness is outside the apartment, we're safe. Let's just have a few drinks and get loose." Leslie said, "If we're gonna die, I want to go out big." Chapter 14 is the perspective of the boy. He is processing the meat of the girl who he zapped with the cattle prod earlier. And it goes into vivid detail about grinding this meat and what it looked like coming out the other end of the grinder. The boy had been taught how to butcher a carcass. He wasn't disturbed by handling the corpse this way. What had disturbed him initially was doing the killing. Even when he decided he wanted to do it and had been excited by zapping the young girl, making her shriek, when it came down to actually finishing the job, the hunting knife had shaken in his hand. It felt suddenly too bulky and heavy for him. The man said, "Maybe you'd rather just shoot her." The boy said, "No, I can do it." The man said, "I shot my first one, remember?" The boy didn't reply. The girl said, "Please." That's when he came at her. How dare she beg for her life? It was like asking him to stay a child forever. He grabbed her hair and ripped at it. He flexed his whole body, and he stared at the veins on her throat. And it says, the boy could not stand for her to be blind in this glorious moment. She had to share the magic with him. And the boy tells the girl to open her eyes. The girl's mother is still bound and gagged in the corner, watching the entire time. As he finished the job, he had taken all she had to offer the world in two simple flicks of a blade. Moments ago, she was a living thing. Now she was only meat. And this aroused the boy. That's all I can say here. It cuts to some time later, and it says, "The man had never been so proud. There was a gleam in his eye. They ate a celebratory dinner of eggplant parmesan with tomato sauce, sides of carrots and peas from the garden. They were vegetarians themselves, even though they sold human meat, passed off as animal meat. The man had brought home a cake from the supermarket, and the boy ate 2 huge slices, and over the next 4 days he ate a piece for dessert every night, surprised that the man allowed it. As the week went on, he realized that he wasn't being told what to eat, and he was being asked what he wanted. He and the man actually had discussions about dinner. Having a say made being an adult sink in a little deeper, because the man called him an adult at age 30. He got to watch or read whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, as long as the chores were done and the pigs were tended to. He and the man played board games and poker together. They felt like family. The man bought him actual boys' clothes from Goodwill, and by the end of August, the boy started accompanying the man on his trips into town. They got chips and soda at the drugstore, and the boy checked out books at the library. He was given an allowance to spend at the arcade, and the man would make deliveries of meat to butcher shops and grocery stores. The boy learned that the veal was very popular to these merchants, and some customers insisted the taste couldn't be beat. Other times, the man would sell them as duck, rabbit, and other specialty meats not as commonly eaten as beef and chicken. People wouldn't easily be able to tell the difference. The man didn't eat meat now, but he had grown up on it, and he had taste tested their human veal and other products to compare their flavor and texture, deciding what it could be passed off as. And when the man would take the boy into town, driving around, he would say, "You gotta go to bigger surrounding towns, sometimes even into the city. Missing girl cases are less likely to be linked to one kidnapper if you space them out." The boy was gaining new wisdom, what the man called street smarts. He watched how the man behaved in public, smiling at certain times, saying hello. The boy watched how the man behaved in public and began to emulate it. To everyone in public, he was introduced as the man's nephew. The only thing he was not allowed to talk about was the source of the meat. The man said other people wouldn't understand what we do. They'd stop us. Then we'd be the ones in cages. Besides, lots of people keep their recipes in the family. The boy didn't understand why people would be against something as simple as raising and slaughtering veal, especially considering they all ate it. But the man always told him about the hypocrisy of carnivores. As they drive home, the man puts his arm around the boy's shoulder, and the man flashed his rotten teeth smile. "The only human being I enjoy talking to anymore is you, buddy. You're my best friend, my family." The boy put his head into the crook of the man's arm. The feeling was more than mutual. Back at Leslie's apartment, everybody is watching the TV. The legend on the news says "World in Chaos," and the scrolling legend below that fed information rapidly. Mandatory quarantine. President instates martial law. All travel banned. Stay in your homes. Do not attempt to evacuate. All emergency lines busy. Millions without power. The scream declared a fatal pandemic. The female news anchor is interviewing some scientists, and he says the theory is that the melting permafrost caused by climate change has released a virus that's been dormant for millennia. The male news anchor jutted in, "But isn't permafrost supposed to be permanent?" And the scientist man says it was permanent when the term was coined. No one predicted weather patterns would change as drastically as they have over the last 3 decades. So the female anchor said, "These ancient viruses can actually come back to life?" He said, "Yeah, some can." He said that this virus is so old that we don't have any medicine developed to even combat it. The virus has been tracked moving from north to south in all parts of the world now. And the male news person says, "Isn't this hysteria a little too convenient for the extreme left? There's no evidence that this is coming out of the ice." The scientist said, "We believe it's probable." And the scientist says that it could be a giant virus, which is one so large it can be seen under a regular microscope. It's believed that this could even be from Neanderthal time. They continued to discuss things about the nature of this disease. The scientist said, "You're missing the point here. Once the virus reaches warmer and more densely populated areas, it spreads faster and more effectively. We must. Breaking news abruptly interrupted the show. A helicopter view of the nation's capital engulfed by flames. A newsman narrating, informing viewers that Washington, D.C. had devolved into a full-scale riot. The White House had been evacuated. Secret Service men began screaming and firing upon people inside, namely the top leaders of the country. Barman put his face into his hands and said, "This is the Anthropocene apocalypse, the time period where humans have control over Mother Nature is ending. All we've done is take advantage of the planet, and this is what we're getting." Angel was biting her nails in the corner. Chuck said, "You want some ketchup for them fingers?" Angel tucked her hand away and said, "Shut up." Chuck took her into the kitchen, and Chuck said to her, "How much do you charge?" Angel said, "Are you serious? You're asking me that now?" Chuck says, "They might as well have a good time while they can." She said, "He's nuts." She said, "Some caveman virus is killing everybody, and you want a piece of ass? What about your girlfriend?" He said, "Actually, she's in on this too. It's more for her than for me." And Angel said, "Wait, she's lesbian?" And Chuck said, "No, she's never been with a girl before, but she's not against it. We need more people for what we want to do. She's too freaked out to do anything like that right now." And Chuck said, "Well, what about this? You're in Leslie's apartment. We're giving you shelter and food and protection." And Angel says, "You're saying I owe you." And Chuck said, "Put out or get out." Chuck hated to admit that he had feelings for someone, but he wanted Leslie to achieve the sense of fullness that she had been searching for. There's a frantic knock on the door, and it's Brittany. And she says, "Chuck, please let us in." And Chuck said, "Who's out there with you?" A female voice spoke, "Keisha." Chuck says, "Who?" She says, "Keisha, you were there when my husband jumped down the stairs." Chuck ran his hand from his forehead to his mouth. Could they afford two more people, two more mouths to feed, and smoke their cigarettes and drink their liquor? Barman said, "They sound terrified." Chuck said, "Of course they do." The knocking got louder, and there were screams coming from down the hall, not from the women outside the door. Chuck opened the door. Brittany and Keisha tumbled into the room. Keisha was holding a dripping box cutter. Brittany was limping. Chuck was slamming the door just as two screamers crashed into the sliver of space between the door jamb. A scrawny arm pushed through, grabbing at Chuck's wrist. When he took his hands off the door to fight his attacker, another screamer forced it open. That's when Chuck recognized them as the two little kids who were always running up and down the halls making noise. Two jaundiced boys, both about 13 years old. They were loud before, but now they were deafening. Their mouths were unhinged, tongues black, teeth glistening. One of the boys had welts and bruises all over him under his ripped shirt, and the other one had shattered glasses with a bloody and swollen eye behind them. Chuck threw the kid with the ripped Superman shirt into the wall. Barman came at glasses with the knife. They continued to battle these kids, and just as Leslie is about to crush this kid's throat with a folding chair, Eugene says, "Wait," holding out his hands. In the chaos, no one noticed him standing up from the couch where they thought he would die. When he spoke, the holes in his cheeks stretched and Chuck could see his molars, but his face was only dribbling with blood now, not gushing like it was before. The flesh was singed, mangled, a crusting ruin. "Jesus," Barman said, staring at him. Eugene said, "Don't kill the kid. Not yet." Leslie said, "What for?" Eugene said, "Maybe we can, study him, maybe find out what's causing this." Chuck said, "I thought you'd be the first one to want to get him out of here, being infected and all." And Eugene said, "Well, after what you all said about that other kid we saw." Barman said, "I know I said we can't kill every screamer, but what else can we do?" Chuck said, "Aren't you worried we're going to catch it?" Eugene said, "I just woke up with my face burning. It's all sticky. What's left to be scared of once your face has been blown off?" Things are going to keep getting worse out there if someone doesn't figure this out. Leslie said, what do we know about diseases? We wouldn't know the first thing about studying this. And I don't want them in my apartment. But despite Eugene's pleading, Leslie finishes the job and takes out the other kid. They all breathed a little easier, but Chuck felt something thick and black spread through them all, the sense that somehow they were even worse off than they had been before. Chapter 16 is the boy's perspective. The boy noticed a wound on the man when he was changing out of his muddy slacks. He saw a ring of holes punched in his calf, the swelling flesh already purple and scaly. He said, what happened? The man said, nothing. One of the hogs bit me. Soon the man couldn't even wear pants because the pain of the material grazing his leg was excruciating. The man didn't even bathe anymore because the water stung his leg, no matter the temperature. And it looked horrible, having inflamed from purple to a vicious scarlet red. The teeth marks had deepened and were much more frightening holes than they were initially. Blisters seemed to orbit around them, fizzing and hissing when the man picked at them. The boy said, isn't there something we can do for it? The man said, I'm fixin' to, and grabbed some bourbon. The boy didn't know much about medicine, but figured there was probably something better than just propping up the leg and getting drunk. But the man refused to see a doctor. The boy had to start doing a lot of jobs around the farm, even more than before, because the man was unable to do anything anymore. And he had to start selling meat and delivering meat in town. He only repeated the rehearsed lines about where the meat came from. And whenever he was asked about anything that wasn't on the script, he just played dumb and told the buyers he'd have to ask his uncle. The man said, don't tell him the truth. First of all, they haven't earned it. If people want to know what's going on with me, tell them I broke my leg falling off a ladder. Let them think I'm a klutz. Doesn't matter. It won't hurt business. The boy said, that's what I'll do. The man said if he tells anyone that the pig did it, then people are going to think ill of pigs more than they already do. The man said, never let him think ill of our pigs. Especially not my sweet Polly girl. The man said, don't worry about his leg. It's going to heal up just fine. But it didn't. 3 days later, his whole leg was discolored and the bite holes were opened wider. It became one single concave lesion. It was as if invisible maggots were feasting on him every day. The boy said, you need to go to the hospital, nearly choking on his words. The man said, I'll be fine. And the boy said, I'm worried. When I was up at the library, I looked at pictures of skin conditions in one of those medical books, and I saw folks whose bodies looked just like yours. It's an infection called necrotizing fasciitis. The man said, those are some fancy words. That reading's making you a little genius, huh? And the boy ignored him and said, your tissue is dying. You got bit by Buster and his mouth was all dirty, and you kept working out there, and you kept getting blood and other stuff on you from prepping the veal. Who knows what's in your wound? And you haven't been washing it or putting on ointments? And the man said, it hurts too much. And the boy said, so it's getting worse. It's spreading. If you don't get a doctor to fix it, you're gonna die. The man took a swig of his bourbon and stood up. I ain't gonna die, son. And the boy realized something. This whole time that he had been living here on this farm, the man had always had all the answers. He had taught the boy everything about life here and what to do and what to say. But now the boy knows something that the man doesn't. The man is going to die. He was right, and the man was wrong. And this left him feeling abandoned. It cuts to sometime later. The boy is about to slaughter another veal, and she says, anything. Anything you want. She told him she was 17. She was the last one that the man had brought home before being entirely disabled. The man was always drunk now. He wasn't very fun company anymore around the farm. The boy was bored and restless without the man's companionship. This was one of the reasons he'd given in to the veal's efforts to talk to him, but not the only one. She was pretty. She says that she will do anything he wants if he lets her go. He said, do you know how to mate? And she says, you mean sex? And the boy said, you said anything I want. And She agrees to do this if he lets her go. She says that he has to take the cuffs off from around her ankles in order to do this, and so he does. And just as he thinks he's about to take advantage of her, she squeezes his balls as hard as she can with her fingernails, and she kept twisting and drawing blood. And as he grew faint, the veal shoved him off of her. He laid there in pain as he heard the chain on her ankle rattle against the ground as she ran away. She swung the door open to the tin shack and tumbled into the dirt. The boy rolled over and she got back up, running naked into the night with no sense of where she was. She started toward the house, but quickly retreated. The boy struggled to pull up his pants, and the girl's scream rang out like a tree snapping in half. The man had shot her. He yelled at the boy to chain her, get her before she runs again. The boy was still in pain, so he used a broom in the corner as a walking stick. And she was frozen, shaking in the dirt, either from fear or from the gunshot. The boy never wanted anyone to suffer the way he wished upon this veal right now. She'd hurt his body and his sense of manhood. Worst of all, she'd embarrassed him. How was he going to explain this? He could lie and say that the cuff broke on its own, but he'd never lied to the man. It would be a breach of their bond, tainting what they had together. The boy would rather own up to his mistake and face punishment than fabricate a story and jeopardize the love and acceptance he felt with the man now. The boy hit her in the side of the face with the broomstick, and then dug it into her gunshot wound and twisted it. The man said, "I guess it's my fault too." He said, "I should have explained the birds and the bees to you, but that doesn't excuse letting a piece of veal go free." He said, "She could run out of here and get into town. Do you want that?" "No, sir. It'd be the end of everything for us, you know." "I know. I'm sorry. It's just a mistake." The man said, "I saddled you with too much work and not enough fun, kid." He says, "I suppose if you want to take advantage of one of the veal now and then, it's okay by me." The boy was able to breathe again. The man pointed at him and said, "There's a right way and a wrong way to go about it." The boy said, "Yes, sir. Will you teach me?" The smile on the man's face was coy, even bashful, but the deterioration of his left cheek made it look grotesque. The man tells the boy to bring her into the room before she dies on us. Chapter 17 cuts back to Chuck's perspective. They are pointing at the corpses of the two screaming preteens that they had just taken out. Chuck said to Eugene, "Do you still want to study them?" Eugene shook his head no and turned away. Barman said, "The professor on the TV mentioned rats. The city's been swarming with them. Maybe that's exacerbating the problem like they did with the plague." And Brittany, in the corner, said, "That was cats. People thought it was carried by rats, so everyone got a cat, when in reality, cats were carrying the disease, which made it spread faster." Gene said, "It's changing. It's getting more advanced." Chuck said, "These two screamers were different from the others. They were coming for us, not each other." Eugene said, "It's getting more advanced." Chuck says, "Or maybe it affects each screamer differently." Barman sighed, "Maybe lots of things." Eugene said, "Is there a bathroom I can use? I need to tend to my face, see how it is." Barman said, "You don't want that. Trust me." Eugene said, "Is it that bad?" Barman said, "It's worse." Leslie sat drinking vodka at the table, and Shitty asked her for some. Keisha and Brittany, who were new to this group, stayed close to each other while giving the others distance. Keisha particularly looked distressed, sitting on the floor with her head hanging. Chuck said that they have to toss these dead bodies out. Barman said, "We should be careful. Maybe wrap them in garbage bags. You have any gloves?" Leslie's broken voice said, "Got dishwashing gloves under the sink, and my winter gloves are somewhere. Don't know if they'll fit you." Chuck said, "The dishwashing ones will do." Barman said, "Now what?" Chuck said, "Outside, I figure, as far away as possible." Barman said, "You want to drag these two through the hall and down the stairs?" Chuck said, "I was thinking out the window. They ought to fit." Barman smirked, "So they could fall down on the sidewalk and splatter like water balloons." Chuck said, "So what if they do?" Barman looked to the others in the group to back him up, but no one did. Barman said, "We can't turn into barbarians here, Chuck. Just because things are chaotic doesn't mean we start tossing dead kids out of fourth-story windows. We have to maintain some basic human decency." Chuck said, "Seriously, where's this all coming from? Ever since I've known you, it's been nothing but nihilism. Let it all burn. Now suddenly human life has value?" They continue to argue. Barman says, "You may not see them as kids, but the law sure will." Chuck says, "What law? Look out the window. That'll convince you there's no reason not to drop these bodies out of it. There's no laws in hell." Leslie says, "Then why don't you go there, Chucky?" Chuck said, "We're already here, damn it." Angel said, "Do it. Throw him out the window. They're gonna vote on it." Barman was the only one not to vote for tossing them out the window. And so he showed his begrudging acceptance by taking one of the boys by the ankles and dragging him toward the lowest windowsill that faced the street. And the stench of a flaming dumpster rose up to greet them through the window. There were distant screams that spoke of terror and anguish, of mothers losing sons and husbands killing their wives. There were no sirens anymore, only shattering, detonating noises. Gunshots and battle cries rang out, and the crackle of flames being fed. No police, no firemen, no paramedics. No one was coming to save them. They shoved the body out the window. Barman looked away, but Chuck watched as it tumbled like an autumn leaf, and then slammed into the concrete, the white plastic of the garbage bag swelling red. The second body turned upside down during its descent. The head exploded upon impact. Later on, Chuck asked what Leslie's problem was. He took her into the bedroom. Her eyes were bleary with intoxication, and there was a foul odor when her breath hit his face. Leslie wouldn't give him any kind of answer. "Is it about you killing that kid?" he said. And she said no. And he said, "Good, because you had to." And she said, Yeah. He said, "Get yourself together." She said, "What for, Chucky? This is it. The end of everything. The scream's infecting the whole world. It's only a matter of time before we die. Either we turn into screamers too, or they'll get in here and murder us." Leslie tells Chuck that she still wants to be full. And she starts cursing at Chuck and telling him that he only has eyes for that little blonde girl out there. And that's the reason you opened the door to save them. You're pathetic. A man your age lusting after a teenager. Chuck slapped Leslie across the face, and she tumbled backward, falling on her ass and spilling what was left of her drink into her lap. She stared into the empty glass and started crying. Chuck sighed. He tried to get her on the bed, but she just kind of laid there face down. Chuck let Leslie rest as he went to go find Angel. Angel followed Chuck back to Leslie's bedroom, and she said, "You still haven't told me what you want me to do." And he said, "Does it matter?" She said, "Guess not." Chuck smacks Leslie on the ass to wake her up from her nap. He said, "Angel's here. Let's do this." Leslie said, "One more thing before we start," and she motioned for him to come closer. And he asks her to repeat it. And he was sure he'd heard her wrong, but he hadn't. It cuts to sometime later, and it says, Chuck lifted Shitty onto the bed. Convincing him to join took little effort. Shitty said, "This sure is interesting," gazing back and forth at the women. What a night this turned out to be. Angel recoiled. "I am not having sex with him." Leslie said, "You won't have to." Angel said, "Yeah, then what am I doing here?" Shitty frowned. "And what am I doing here?" And the first thing that Leslie does is take off Shitty's wool hat and ran her fingers through his matted hair. The poor man's lower lip trembled at her touch. Leslie told Shitty to take off his pants. She also tells Chuck and Angel to do the same. Chuck is hesitant. It seems that he is not even 100% sure of Leslie's full plan, but he's willing to go along with it to make her happy. So I'm going to say this very carefully. They are having a moment where Shitty's leg is in Leslie. Leslie is giving Chuck a blowjob, and Angel is fisting Leslie's back door. And it ends with Leslie seemingly being satisfied, and then mere seconds later, Angel starts screaming with her fist still inside of Leslie's back door. It just goes downhill from there. So now Angel is screaming and in an absolute hysterical rage while her fist is in somebody. That's not a good thing to happen. The description is very vivid about what this is like. And Barman opens the door just after Chuck had snapped Angel's neck, finally putting a stop to her. Barman asked what is going on, and Chuck said it's okay now. When Chuck returned to Leslie, she was holding herself, sobbing and shaking. Angel's arm is still in her, and although Chuck had never been an empathetic guy, he certainly hurt for this woman he'd come to know more deeply than any other. Leslie went to shower by herself. Chuck had helped her as best as he could, but then she shouted at him to get out. She didn't want sympathy or help patching up, so he let her be. He also wondered if she'd ever leave the bathroom again. Perhaps a long hot shower was where she wanted to be if this was her last day. There were a lot worse places to die. When Chuck had gotten her up, she was bleeding profusely. Chuck wondered how bad the internal damage was. Barman talks about the news again, but they're not saying any real news. They're just contradicting each other. Politicians broadcasting from the safety of their home. No one can agree what the virus is caused by, even still. So Chuck says, "You think this is really it?" Barman said, "You know what this reminds me of? Evolution. When nature sees a species is no longer viable, that has nothing to offer, it finds a way to terminate it. Usually it's slower and more graceful than this, but it's our fault. We're the ones tearing each other to ribbons. It's our brains that are wired to turn us into screamers when this virus hits us. Society had its chance, and we all blew it. Humankind is about as noble as a septic tank full of maggots. The wars, the SA, murders, police brutality, racism, animal cruelty, the glorification of greed. Humans trample each other at stores for Black Friday deals and hoard toilet paper at the first sign of trouble. Only makes sense that we don't die off as one, holding hands, but rather as a civil war of the species. Our minds go right to rage when we get nature's goodbye kiss." Chuck said, "I don't think it's a conscious decision," and he lit a cigarette. "This scream just makes people crazy. Must have some sort of effect on the aggression button." Barman smiled, but it was bitter. "Decades ago, this guy climbed to the top of some tower in Texas and shot as many people as he could. His autopsy showed a brain tumor they say may have been pressing that aggression button, as you call it." Chuck said, "Well, there you go. Maybe this makes a tumor in your head. I don't know." Eugene stepped forward from the end of the hall and said, "That's horseshit." Leslie had patched him up even after she had been badly hurt herself, so his face was a hodgepodge of small bandages and bloody toilet paper, a mummy dipped in marinara. Eugene says that he believes it's an STD. They stood there in silence. Chuck said, "Get out of here. The virus can manifest itself naturally, but if you have sex, you can pass it off to someone else, like crabs. But in this case, they get it, and you walk away clean. It jumps from host to host." And Chuck said, "So these screamers are trying to have sex with us?" And Eugene says, "No, by the time you start screaming, it's already too late." Barman frowns and tells Gene that he's stupid. Eugene says that he heard from a podcast that you might be able to get clean by dumping it on someone preemptively. Barman stepped closer and said, "Oh yeah, well that's sort of like what some people in Africa believed about AIDS, that having sex with a virgin would cure them, but that just spread AIDS more." at the expense of, here his voice trembled, SA-ing a teenage girl. And Eugene looks toward Brittany, off in the corner. A virgin is exactly what they said worked best. Barman grabbed Eugene by the collar and pressed him into the wall so hard a framed photo fell to the floor. Barman said, "Listen to me. If you think I'm gonna let you force yourself on that girl, you're sorely mistaken." And Eugene smiled and said, "I'm reasonable, Barman. I don't want her all to myself." Barman shoved him again, causing some homemade gauze to fall from Eugene's face, and took the kitchen knife from his belt. Barman threatens Eugene again and says, "There's no cops holding up law and order, so this podcast person is trying to validate cruelty and incite violence upon women for their own twisted reasons. I'll be damned if I'm going to let you or anyone else take part in it." He looked at Chuck, but it seems that Chuck also does not agree with Eugene. Eugene said, "All right, it was just an idea," which is back to the boy's perspective. It describes how the man taught the boy how to mate with the veal. This is the girl who was shot while trying to run away, and they believe that she is close to death. In the coming days, she did not die. It seemed that the bullet missed anything vital, and the man tells the boy that he wants him to keep mating with this veal. He said, "You're young, so you're going to want it every day anyhow." And so the boy did it gladly. He learned the hard way that the man was right about veal. They were all liars, all cruel. They weren't human the way he and the man were, not even the way townspeople were. Their behavior was such that they couldn't be trusted or even remotely understood. Unless to give them orders, the boy would never speak with them again. Later on, the man asked the boy to drive him into town. He tells the boy to stay in the truck as they arrive at the pharmacy. The boy says he wanted to look at something. The man said, "Don't argue with me. This isn't a happy-go-lucky trip. It's serious business." His tone made the boy tense. He hadn't heard such harshness since his earliest days on the farm. "Yes, sir." Now when we get there, the man tells him to park around the back of the building, keep the motor running. Any cops show up, you get out of here even if I'm not here. Got it? The boy said, "What's going on?" The man said, "Do like I tell you. Antibiotics is something you need a prescription for, and I don't have one." The man says that he's going in there to rob the pharmacy for antibiotics and also some money, some cash for them to live on. The boy said, "You can barely get around. I'll be faster." The man said, "No. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but you've never done this before. I have. You don't know what to look for to keep from getting caught, and there's no time now to teach you." The boy said, "How am I going to learn unless you let me try?" And the man unrolled his wool cap down his face, revealing that it was a ski mask. "I just don't want to see you get hurt, son." He said, "I gots to do it on my own." The man takes the rifle from the rack of the truck, and he struggled to hold it with one hand while opening the passenger door at the same time, but he managed. Watching the man limp his way toward the building didn't give him any encouragement. The boy wished that he had the courage to say goodbye, in case this was the last time he'd see him. It was a black and poisonous thought that he failed to shake from his head. He sat there with the truck idling for a long time. He chewed the inside of his cheek. He kept waiting for something to go wrong, an alarm to go off, or a gun. Finally, he saw the man round the corner, and he was moving faster than the boy thought he was still capable of. He held the rifle low, leaning on it with the butt hitting the ground like a walking stick. In his other hand was a plastic shopping bag with a smiley face on it. The man grinned. The man said, "We got lucky. The safe had some deposits that hadn't gone to the bank yet. Not a fortune, but enough to last a couple months, and I got medicine." The boy said, "All right." The man said, "I got something for you, too." The man took out a box from the bag. The boy kept his eyes on the road as he blew through a stop sign, and then he glanced at the printing on the package. It said, "Home Pregnancy Test." The boy finds out that the veal is pregnant. You've proven yourself and then some. You ought to be allowed to go out on the hunt. The boy says that he won't let the man down. The man says that they'll head out tomorrow night. He said it's best to lie low while the robbery is being investigated. And one other thing, as long as that veal is knocked up, they might as well see how things go with the baby idea. We ain't got nothing to lose. Not saying we'll turn into no baby farm, just want to see what happens. The boy knew how to pick his battles. He said, okay, I reckon I better chain her so that she's not on her belly anymore. The man pulled the boy into an embrace, and the boy kissed him on the cheek, unbothered by the decomposition. The man breathed deep and said, I love you, son. The boy said, I love you too, Pa. It was a daring word. He'd never called the man that before. He'd never called him anything but sir. While that level of respect was right, it seemed too formal now. Maybe he'd crossed a line, but he'd felt it was the one the man wouldn't mind being crossed. He'd come to think of the man as his father long ago, but had doubted himself until this tender moment. He'd taken a lot of risks today, but they'd all been worth it. He'd hoped this one would be too. When the man hugged him tighter, the boy knew he'd been right. Chapter 19 is Chuck's perspective. Keisha asks, that other woman, your wife, is she okay? He said, not my wife, and no, not really. Keisha didn't know what to say. She said, I know we don't really know each other, but you did try and help me when my husband... Well, you know, I appreciate that. I know you've got a good heart. Chuck looked away. Women had been wrong about him before, but this was the most delusional one yet. He was no Samaritan, no hero. He was 200 pounds of drunken, pointless shit. He needed a damn cigarette. Keisha said, I need your help. Chuck said, we let you in here. Isn't that enough? She said, I have to leave. Chuck said, no one's stopping you, but if that door gets opened, one of those screamers could rush on in here. Best it stays closed. Keisha's eyes grew damp and Chuck crossed his arms. She says that she was just getting home from work when those crazy kids, the 13-year-olds who were screamers, came after her. Brittany was in the hall when she came up the stairs. She didn't get to her apartment. Chuck says, so what's important about going there? Tears rolled down both her cheeks, and she said, my babies. Chuck said, I hope you're referring to cats. She said, no, twins, a boy and a girl, 9 months old. They're at home with my mom. Chuck said, oh, Christ. Chuck says, all it takes is a minute for you to get killed. She took a deep breath and said, I understand. Can I at least take one of those knives? He said, I didn't say no to helping you yet. What do you have in your place? What do you mean? She said. Any cigarettes, booze, food, anything you can give me? If I'm going to risk my neck, I get to cherry pick what you've got. She said, I got some food and some wine. Take whatever you want. Just leave the stuff for my babies. Barman said, I'll go. Keisha said, I'd be so grateful for your help. Chuck said, I thought you were too beat up from earlier when you got hurt at the bar. Barman said, I'm not 100%, but I'm better now that I've rested. I'll take her. Wait a second. I get to cherry pick, Chuck says. I need those cigarettes. Barman said, I'll get you your damn cigarettes, Chuck. You just stay here and take care of your woman. Chuck said, ain't nothing I can do for Leslie. Barman stepped uncomfortably close. You can goddamn be here for her. Don't let her suffer alone. Depending on how bad her injuries are, she could be dying in that bathroom while you're worried about smoke and booze. Shame on you. She's your woman whether you want to call her that or not. Wife, girlfriend, or friends with benefits, the semantics don't matter. Now treat her right. Do some good for once in your life. Suddenly you're the caring person, huh, Barman? Chuck says. Barman says, I don't owe you an explanation for the things I do. Barman turned to Keisha and said, you should be with your family right now, not with scumbags like us. Get the blonde girl too. She'll be safer with you and your mom than she'll be here. Keisha tried to hug him, but Barman gently nudged her away. Brittany was resting in fetal position on the floor, her face turned to the wall. Keisha gently touched her on the back to get her attention. On the other side of the room, Shitty was still drunk and in a daze from all that happened. His head hung low, eyes closed, mumbling. Eugene was stretched out on the sofa again, possibly asleep. Some of his face had scabbed over now, leaving him looking like old pizza. Chuck covered Leslie's body with the blanket. He hadn't felt this kind of grief since they'd strapped Quade Cruz into the electric chair. She was gone. Leslie taught him one thing that Pa had been wrong about. Not all women were veal. Some women were human, odd as that may seem, given how different they were from men, but some males were also different from men and closer to being women, such as Brittany, formerly Bentley. Chuck thought of Barman's soul-crushing guilt over being someone who essayed someone. Should Chuck feel that same guilt for what he'd done on the farm? Was he capable of it? Should he try to force it somehow? He'd done much worse. He'd also done more heinous things than S.A., but just like him, Eugene and Barman had treated women like veal. Did it matter if it was today or 30 years ago? Did it matter if they were remorseful or not? What would it change? He realized, in a world full of monsters, even heroes have fangs. Chuck hadn't essayed anyone since his days on the pig farm. He didn't want to go to prison like Pa did, after all of his effort to protect him from going there. Chuck had long stopped making people suffer and die, but dying hardly seemed a worse fate in a world this toxic. Leslie's cat appeared like a wraith, and Chuck opened the door to free him. The cat, whatever his damn name was no longer an inside cat. Let him enjoy his newfound freedom. Nothing still living should be in this apartment, Chuck thought. This was Leslie's mausoleum now. He even struggled to get Eugene's ass out the goddamn window just so she'd have the place to herself again.